guys, so today I'm going to show you how to make a yeast bread dough. A yeast bread dough is the same type of ingredients for any dough that you would like to make. This one is going to be specifically for cinnamon rolls, but you could use the same style of dough for pizza crust, for regular bread, for rolls, a lot of different variety of things. But today it's going to be specifically for cinnamon rolls. So we are going to be using a KitchenAid mixer for this recipe. The first thing that you need to know about yeast is that yeast is a living organism, and it's activated by warm water. When you are making a yeast bread dough, you are going to need to make sure that your water is warm. The suggestion for the water temperature is between 105 and 115 degrees. Mine is right about 108. You want to make sure that the water is not too hot. If the water is too hot, it will actually kill the yeast, but you do want to make sure that it's warm enough to activate the yeast when you're using it. And it won't rise if the yeast is killed because you need that live yeast to have that carbon dioxide reaction from the yeast. So yeast is similar to baking powder and baking soda in that it's a leavening agent, but yeast produces a more quality product, and it does also take longer. So what we're gonna do for this recipe is in our KitchenAid mixer, we're gonna mix together the warm water, again between 105 and 115 degrees, 2 tablespoons of oil. And so what the oil does in the recipe is it's going to increase the tenderness. And so that's generally what fat does for recipes, is it increases tenderness. Next, we are going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar. And so what the sugar is going to do is it's actually going to provide food for the yeast, and will help the yeast start activating to help the product start rising faster. And then our last is the 1.5 teaspoons of yeast. And so I'm just going to be mixing this together in my mixer. And then I'm gonna set a timer, and in 5 minutes, we'll come back and see what the mixture looks like. We need to let it rest to start getting that carbon dioxide reaction from the yeast. All right, at this point, the mixture has been sitting for 5 minutes. The yeast has started reacting with the hot water, or the warm water rather, not hot, because we don't want to kill the yeast. The warm water and feeding on the sugar. And so this has started to create some carbon dioxide reaction, and it was producing little bubbles as it was sitting. So now we're ready to mix the rest of the ingredients into our mixture. Before we do that, we're actually gonna change to the dough hook to help knead our bread better. So I'm gonna switch that out. All right, so the first ingredient I'm going to add is a teaspoon of salt to that mixture. And salt helps to regulate the action of yeast, and it helps to inhibit some of the enzymes in the yeast from producing too much fermentation in that carbon dioxide reaction. Then to that, I'm going to add 1 beaten egg. And what the egg does is it helps to add flavor and richness to our dough. And then lastly, we're gonna add flour. And so we're gonna add in just about half of the flour to get us started. And then as we're mixing it, I'll go ahead and add in more flour as we go. And as you can see right now, it's not necessarily pulling away from the sides of the bowl and everything getting mixed in together because there's just not enough mixture in the bowl. So as I add more flour, that will help all of it start coming together. And so before I mix it the rest of the way, I just want to mention what flour does for the recipe. So we obviously know that in baked products, flour adds structure. But in yeast spreads, when it's mixed with a liquid and kneaded, which the dough hook is actually kneading the dough for us, it helps to develop gluten in the flour, which is the protein in the flour, and that helps to support the carbon dioxide that is produced by yeast to make the bread. For the dough, to how we know it's been kneaded long enough by the dough hook, is that all of the dough pulls into a ball on the dough hook and pulls away from the sides of the bowl when the machine is turned on high. And so this is how you know you've added enough flour. Depending on humidity and how perfectly you measured the flour, you may actually need a little more flour than what the recipe calls for, but I can tell that mine is complete because all of that dough pulls away from the sides of the bowl. So from here, I'm gonna go ahead and take my dough out. Okay, and then yeast bread dough is going to need to rise 2 times for a traditional dough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the dough out of my bowl. I'm going to put it in a large bowl, and I'm going to put 1 tablespoon of oil in that bowl. And the reason I need the dough to go in a large bowl is because while it's resting, it's going to double in size while that yeast has time to proof. So I'm going to take my ball of dough. I'm going to kind of just rotate that into the oil. I don't actually need to knead this dough because the KitchenAid mixer already did that for me. If you don't have a KitchenAid mixer, you can certainly make this type of dough. You would just need to stir it by hand till the point that you can't stir it by hand anymore, and then you would be kneading it by hand. And it would take probably 2 to 3 times as long. So once I've rolled that ball of dough in the oil, I can let it rest. You'll know when the dough is ready, when it's smooth and elastic. So as I'm kind of like pulling it apart, it's smooth and elastic. When you push it in, you know, the indent will kind of stay. We're gonna let this rest, and then I'll roll it out. And I'll show you the next part, and then we'll let it rest again to rise a second time before we bake them. The recipe says that at this point you should cover it and put it in the refrigerator. Because I want to make my cinnamon rolls today, I'm going to cover it and just leave it out at room temperature until it's doubled, and then I will be back. Now our dough has had time to rise, and so what we're going to do is punch the dough down, and this will help to release some of the carbon dioxide before we start to try to shape the cinnamon rolls. And from there, I'm just going to pull it out. I'm gonna lightly flour my countertop. Okay, and you really don't need to knead the dough anymore. I'm just gonna kind of make sure that it's all smooth and elastic. Forgot to grab out my rolling pin. And so now we're gonna roll it into a 9 by 12 inch rectangle. And so that's about the size of the pan that we're going to be using, which is this. So just using a rocking back and forth. Whenever I'm using a rolling pin, I don't actually tend to use the edges of it because I feel like I'm able to like push down a little harder by just putting my hands over the top of it. And you may notice as you're pushing it out that some of the little air bubbles are gonna pop as you're going, and that just kind of helps to release that more of that carbon dioxide that you have been that has been building up during the fermentation process while the dough was proofing. I want to make sure I'm not sticking on the bottom. Like I'm almost getting there. Kind of just keeps coming back, but that should be about right. Perfect. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush about 2 tablespoons of melted butter. The recipe calls for margarine. It, you know, really, whichever one that you have for this recipe is fine because it's not going to affect its outcome like when we were making cookies. Since the fat is just going on the inside and it's not part of the baking of the product. So get all that out. And then I have a mixture here of 1 tablespoon of cinnamon, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, and I've already just mixed those together. And then I'm gonna just very generously sprinkle that on top. And it is gonna seem like it's got a ton of sugar. But if you remember back to when we were making the dough, we only put 2 tablespoons of sugar into the dough. And so we're adding about another 1/4 cup here with 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. That equals 4 tablespoons, 4 tablespoons and a 1/4 cup. Think about like when we made brownies, I think we used an entire cup of sugar. So it looks like a lot. It is kind of a lot. Makes it turn out really well. So now we're gonna roll the cinnamon roll dough. We can roll it this way to give us really fat cinnamon rolls. Those tend to take longer to bake, and I feel like the insides don't get cooked all the way and the outsides kind of get overdone. So I like to roll it the long ways. Okay. And then there is a fun little trick for cutting the cinnamon rolls. I could grab out a sharp knife and just cut them off, but that's just gonna like push them down. So I'm gonna use actually just some thread. You could use floss. And I'm gonna go underneath, and then when I cross it, it actually just cuts it off really nicely. And then I have my little cinnamon roll. I'm gonna need to spray my pan that they're going into. And then I'm gonna put them seam side up. Okay, where did my thread go? There it is. And then I'm just gonna continue to go and cut them off, place them in my pan. At this point, once I have all of the cinnamon rolls in a pan, the yeast bread dough is going to do its second rise. So this is a traditional method of making a yeast bread dough, and so it does need 2 rises. This could be done in the refrigerator. If we were at school, we would definitely do this in the refrigerator because it would need to sit overnight. And usually when I'm making cinnamon rolls for my family, I would do both of these steps on one day. And I would say that it took about an hour and a half to 2 hours for the first proofing time for that dough to double in size. It would probably take about the same amount of time if I were to just leave these out on the counter for them to proof before baking them. But a lot of times when I make them for my family, I'll throw them in the fridge overnight. That way I can throw them in the oven and they'll be nice and hot and fresh in the morning. So get all of our cinnamon rolls into the pan. I'm going to want to cover this pan with plastic wrap and then either put it in the fridge or leave it out on the counter to proof for overnight in the refrigerator, or at least until doubled in size, or 1.5 to 2 hours on the countertop. At this point, my cinnamon rolls have doubled in size, and so I'm going to put them into an oven that's been preheated to 400 degrees, and I'm going to bake them for 20 minutes. While my cinnamon rolls are cooking, I am going to go ahead and make the glaze for the cinnamon rolls. This is optional, but who doesn't love a little glazed frosting on their cinnamon rolls, right? So I'm going to mix together 2 tablespoons of melted margarine or butter, using butter, 1 cup of powdered sugar, and then 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. And then to that, I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of hot water, and then I can add more if needed. So for the glaze, we do want it to be slightly thick. You could try to whisk it by hand, but it's hard to get that glaze consistency without something electric. So I'd suggest using either a hand mixer or your kitchen mixer. And right now I have a pretty thick glaze. I'm going to add just maybe 1/2 teaspoon more of water, thin it out just slightly. And there is the finished glaze for my cinnamon roll. Here is my finished product, the finished cinnamon rolls with a nice light golden brown color on the top. And I'm going to just take some of that glaze and put them on each one, and it'll kind of melt into the cinnamon roll as they're still a little warm. Here are my finished cinnamon rolls.